Good afternoon, good evening. We have a wonderful session lined up, which I hope will be a nice respite, if only momentary, from the current events. I did want to say that the Jordan Center decided collectively to continue with our regular programming, not entirely separately from what's going on internationally, what's going on in Ukraine. It's a position of the Jordan Center that we're categorically supportive of the Ukrainian people. In addition to that, we're supportive of those who are doing their best to both oppose the current war and also to do what we can to alleviate some of the suffering in the small ways that we find possible. We're continuing our programming nevertheless. There's still a Russia, there's still the Russian, sort of the space that's covered by the Jordan Center, which includes areas around Russia, without any doubt about where our sentiments lie. I can tell you that our presenter right now, our speaker, is Juliette Cadiot of the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales and CERSEC, is very involved right now in some of these efforts, much more actively, I think, than many others. And I find the colleagues in Europe and in France in particular have been taking a very active part, both on the moral level, but also on the practical level. So we're grateful that Juliette has been able to take some time off to share what I think is a very important book, another very important book from Juliette, which is about, in this case, Soviet history, which includes none other than Ukraine itself. About Juliette. So Juliette is a very dear colleague based in Paris, who came onto the scene with a book which was very much, and I mean this very literally, which is a groundbreaking book, which came out just around the time that we're beginning to pay more attention to multinationality and ethnicity in the Soviet Union. And her book really laid certain foundational principles for studying and understanding the problem of nationality, avant lettres even, meaning even before the idea was being used by contemporaries, and focusing on the late 19th century and the ways in which nationality was and was not discussed. And it became something of a reference point for the many others who came afterward to write about nationality. Aside from that, she's been very active professionally in establishing a renowned program at the École des Hautes Études and CERSEC. And she's quite a presence and quite a force in the French Academy, but also international. And she spent time here as well in North America. And we've been happy to host her in person in the past, unfortunately at a distance right now. And what she's agreed to do, again, taking out time from a very busy schedule, dealing with an immediate crisis in an active way. I mean, many of us are just concerned with changing names right now. Juliette is actually involved in helping people. And she's taking off the time to talk to us about her most recent book, which she can hold up for us, or I can hold up for you. Hold on. Which goes under the title La Société des voleurs. Shall we translate that as the Society of Thieves, Juliette?
Maybe, yeah. I don't know what it sounds in English, but it's terrible in French as well. I mean,
yeah, I think thieves. I think thieves, because robbers would be more like holdups. And the book came out. How long has it been now, Juliette? When did you actually hold it in your hands?
Yeah, 2021 in April. That means that yes, more or less a year ago.
Yeah. So I won't go into the details of the book itself, other than to tell you that it's this problem of corruption and what we call corruption in a situation which is, in which ownership, property, and all of these things are understood according to different constitutional propositions. So as usual, the book is a feat of research, and Juliette is nothing but a powerhouse when it comes to researching. But it's also, it takes thought about how we even categorize an act in a different constitutional context. The format we're going to follow today is that Juliette will speak. I think our discussant, Anne O'Donnell, asked her to speak less, and I asked her to speak more, so she's going to have to decide for herself. But either way, she's going to speak and introduce the subject matter of the book, following which Anne O'Donnell, my colleague at NYU, will comment on the book. I assume this will take the form of a dialogue. Anne, is that right? So Juliette, if it pleases you to go ahead and speak to us about your book, and congratulations.
Okay, and thank you very much for the invitation. And I thank also the Jordan Center who host me and helped me to write the first draft of an important chapter. And I am very happy to share today this moment, even if I should say that the Ukraine crisis is quite a very sad and frightening moment. We are all very busy in France in trying to help Ukrainian colleagues and Russian colleagues now. And also since the book was also very linked for me to Ukraine, even if it's a book about Soviet Union in general, I got the opportunity to get access to very good Ukrainian archives from the secret police and from others and the party. And I should say that this book for me is very connected, even if it's not on the national question at all, to some memories of Kyiv and also of the kindness of some Ukrainian colleagues who are now in danger. Maybe I just start today. If you have any problem to understand my English and my whatever, you can stop me. And but I will just start today to try to explain how I came to this. I came to this topic, and also to try to summarize a little bit my book and some of my methods and historiographical background and arguments, of course. At the beginning, when I was in Ukraine and in Russia in archive, and I wanted to do something about Soviet law and Soviet legality, also because this domain of history of law is not very well developed in contemporary history in France. And for me, it was interesting to start to work also with this scholarship was more developed in the US, for example. And my two first articles with this work were on lawyer, first of all, and I published an article on lawyer. It's possible to get access also in the English version, and public prosecutors. And during this research about justice and law, I was very, very surprised by the omnipresence of the slogan of protection of socialist property, and by the importance of prosecution of thieves. And as we know, it's always a challenge when you see that a theme is omnipresent and there is not so many studies of the theme. And I was wondering why. And also, I at this time, I remember the Carl Jacobi Crimes Against Nature, where he will introduce his book saying that you need to pay attention to an omnipresent subject. The problem is that the wealth of the archives, I mean, the theme was everywhere, and it was very difficult to know how to stop to do some research, but I got the chance to have the opportunity to go in the archives to live in Russia for 2 years. It was a kind of grant by the French government and my institution, and it made possible to try to go through this law and all this material this law were connected to. As you may know, there were two laws or two decrees, Stalinist decree on theft of socialist property. The first one was in 1932. It was in August 1932, and Stalin decided, because we can see in his correspondence that he was himself who decided to punish a thief of socialist property or they were shot or they were sent to the Gulag for 10 years. This law didn't last very long. That means that there were amnesty in 1936, and normally this law was applied especially against big thieves. But nonetheless, the politicization of economic crimes and of theft was important, since in the Stalin constitution in '36, there was a sentence that thieves of socialist property were enemy of the people. Means that, and in my book, because the publisher asked me to do and to cut the manuscript was very long, I focus more on the second law, which is a law of 1947, where thieves were punished by from 5 to 25 years in Gulag camps. That means that the punishment for socialist against theft of socialist property was more important than for murder, for example. These decrees were public. I mean, it was not a secret operation for nothing. It was very pedagogical. And they are also known. That means that there were some studies and articles by Yoram Gorlinsky, by Nicola Wirth, or Peter Solomon. And they underline especially the cruelty of the law, since the decree against theft of socialist property were published during famines in 32 and 47. What is important to understand that Stalin, when he decided when he thought about the first 32 law, he knew that it was something which was a kind of scandalous. Normally, in the socialist society, theft shouldn't be a big problem. First of all, with more egalitarian regime and with the economic development, theft should disappear in a more egalitarian society. And secondly, the penal code of the beginning of the 20s was very clement toward theft. That means the idea that when we are poor and you can steal was not a big problem. Also, to try to convince the Politburo leader that it was important to publish this law on theft of socialist property at the very beginning of the 30s, he decided to build this law around a new principle. And he wrote that it was very important to say to the Soviet people that socialist property was sacred and inviolable, exactly as private property was sacred and inviolable in the bourgeois or capitalist world. And he makes this comparison, and this comparison was used afterward, and we will see at the end of my talk that I think we have to take kind of seriously this comparison. And in this work, in my book, I use a lot of archives from the Procuracy, from the police, the regular police and the secret police, and of course of scholars, Ministry of Justice. And my idea is it was also to see that from the beginning, in the thinking of the jurists, especially as the judges, there are a difference between the small theft, which you should eradicate during famine, but was not the only issue, and the big one. And I use especially some comments by Michel Foucault in Discipline and Punish to see that criminalize doesn't mean to eradicate a crime. It's also to get some information about the crimes and to reorganize the crime. And this law, the decrees, the 47 decrees, make it possible to know more about the daily life of a Soviet citizen, but also about the corrupt bureaucracy, to get some file on them and to understand very well. And Stalin was informed about big cases in a almost daily basis, and to understand more the way the Soviet people organize their economic, social, and sometimes political life. And this law finally became a window in a kind of underground society, or an underground political, social, economic milieu, where you have all strata of the society, from the very poor who were sent to the gulag to the wealth people, and is why also to deal with this material, I decided to use various methodology and historiography. And my idea was to try to describe how a kind of concept or slogan or idea or value, which is the protection of socialist property, comes from the Stalin mind to the law, to the enforcement of the law, and to the mind of the people. That means that to have this kind of how a new value, a new system could go to the population. And for that, I use, for the last point, I use the letter we were sent from the gulag camps by the thieves, and they asked for clemency, for pardon. And you have this wonderful letter by thieves, where they describe why they stole and how they understand more or less what Stalin thought about socialist property. Because normally you don't have memories of thieves. I mean, we don't have exactly the same kind of diaries or a correspondence as we have for other or political prisoners. It's one of the chapters. It's about this voice of the thieves, but I also use one case study for one corrupt network in Kyiv, because even if it was not known, but at this time, for big thieves, you can use the qualification as sabotage, and there were also projects to deport the family of big thieves in Ukraine. And also I study more, especially in the first chapter, the birth and the development of the very idea of socialist property and of defense of socialist property. Again, my idea is why to take seriously the Stalin attempt. And it was also a way to more generally try to maybe denaturalize or take some step back about our own system of property, the naturality of our own system of defense of property, and to remind us that all property systems are crafted and invented, sometimes very quickly, and they could be very effective. And that property is at the center of the edifice of this regime. And also I try to draw at the very end or at the beginning of the book, but I would like to have your comment on that and develop a little bit more on this issue about some comparison between the capitalist system, regime of property, and the socialist, state socialist maybe, regime of property, since I really saw in this Stalinist accumulation of wealth through this concept of defense of property, so something we could be similar to the bourgeoisie or capitalist system of property and the same system of accumulation. And why? Because I especially use E.P. Thompson, but you have other, of course, researcher you can use, will show how the process to label things we were before or from common use or without value, and to to make them property, change the daily life of the people, change exchanges, there's the value of things, and are very critical to understand a system. And in the two cases, the regime of property had some very similar patterns, and I stop with that. That means that the same kind of accumulation of wealth through a protection, a very harsh protection of property, same kind of equality of power and protection, because in the book also I show to what extent the people in the camp were mostly poor people, and there were also there were system of protection, patronage for party member. That means that the regime was aware that they were corrupt, but they could use it or not to use it. And I try to describe also this peculiar milieu, especially in chapter 3 and 4. There is the same pattern in the search of new resources, so characteristic of the 20th century model. And I think I can elaborate a little bit more on this direction, it will be very useful, even if it's not so developed in the book, but nonetheless, it's I think described in the narrative of the book. And I will stop here. Is it okay? I don't know how long it lasts.
Much too little, Juliette, much too little.
That's wonderful, Juliette.
But
Okay.
Don't worry. So what we're going to do now is we're going to hand it over to Anne, and then we'll hand it over to the group. So Anne, if you...
Great, thank you so much. Juliette, thank you for this wonderful book that I want to second Yanni's comment that I think it's very important, and I'm so excited to be speaking about it today. I'm going to make my comments a bit more perhaps narrative or explaining what I understand to be some of the main arguments of the book than I might otherwise, simply because it is in French and I want to make it as accessible as possible to a wide audience, to encourage those among our listeners who speak French to go read it, and those who don't, to give them, a framework for some of the ideas. So one of the things that I think is most remarkable about this work is that it takes thieving, this concept, society of thieves, this concept that's frequently studied as a form of deviance, and thus something that is marginal in a double sense. First, because it's perceived and cast as antisocial behavior, and following this as behavior that's outside the norm, outside the heft of regular society. And it illuminates thieving instead in the Soviet Union as an activity that was at the very heart of the Soviet project, at the center of antisocial, but embedded within and woven throughout the practices of governance and daily life. This, to me, is a very important argument. Thieving was situated this way, Cadiot makes clear, precisely because it struck at the very core of the Soviet project to create non-private ownership of the means of production and potentially of much more. Consumer movables, private enterprise, the very stuff of life. In the Soviet context, there's an additional layer, an additional sort of construal that has predominated often in the study of thieving, which is to take it as an expression of opposition to the forces of power, purposeful or otherwise. Opposition in particular to the central tenets of socialism. Here too, Cadiot shows us that this is not the case. We see that in fact, theft was an outgrowth of profound instabilities introduced by the creation of this new category, socialist property, which was construed largely as state property, as she explores. This instability, this unstable category of state property, was introduced immediately on the heels of the revolution. And as Cadiot shows us, it endured up through the period that she is treating, the decade immediately before and after the Second World War. The category of theft, therefore, as much as it was the product of individual choices and behaviors, was equally, and is treated here, as the product of unanswered questions about the appropriate relationship between individual people in their capacity as private people or as personal entities, private or personal, those two, we can get into the differences in those two terms if we like. But so as individuals in their roles as state employees and thus defenders of state property, and in the actual substance of that property, how could they use it? What was the nature of their commitments to it, their powers over it, and their obligations toward it? We get a number of wonderful snippets, wonderful moments when this question was posed in the smallest interactions of daily life in this book. It's one of the incredible richnesses of the archival evidence that Cadiot brings to us, that Juliette brings to us. One that struck in my mind was the question of fishing, how to think about fishing when all land is owned by the state. And what we see in one of the cases that Juliette brings to us is that if fish are alive when they are caught, if they are caught by a person and are alive when removed from the water, brought into their personal control, this is an acceptable use of a public asset. If they have already been caught, however, if they are dead when they are appropriated, their appropriation constitutes a theft of state property, as labor has already been embedded in them. We see this question unfolding in numerous dimensions, rising all the way up to the more esoteric questions of how to think about accounting and budgets in socialist enterprises. How is economic loss within those enterprises to be understood and construed? What about the failure of an enterprise manager to recover stolen or lost property? To make a decision, this is a question of a very classic question, I should add, of Soviet political economy, which is what was the nature of the powers of enterprise managers in the Soviet system. Here we see that enterprise owners are made accountable and legally responsible for losses, which are punished as property crime. We have a sense from anthropological works of the late Soviet period that the theft of personal property came in for much sharper social sanction than did the theft of state property, that people were more or less indifferent to the latter. Here we get a much more nuanced view of these questions for the post-war period. In particular, I think this is one of the interesting features of the book, is that it really toggles back and forth between and helps us to think about the sometimes consonant, sometimes dissonant roles being played by law as an instrument of governance and social mores. And what Juliette was saying about watching this slogan, essentially, the protection of socialist property, travel from the state down to what the actors who she pays a lot of attention to, very importantly, and identifies as street level bureaucrats, down into the population, is one of the achievements of the book. But balancing these different levers, as it were, for the governance of society, law and social mores. Both law and social sanction, as she shows, governed this field of theft, of what it was and what to do about it. As she argues, the stakes for the theft of state property were high, in part because the social sanction around its protection was much weaker. Law was understood as necessarily harsh because violations of state property were not ingrained or as ingrained in social mores as being forbidden and as an expression of socialism and its values. This endeavor produced particular attitudes to theft and ownership, not always those, as is often the case, intended. These are articulated by Cadiot through this notion of what she calls socialist humanism. A willingness to tolerate certain violations of state property. And this willingness, she shows, was motivated by diverse and sometimes contradictory principles of socialism, such as, for instance, the attention that was given in Soviet society to individual life stories and the burdens that individuals bore, a search for inner motivations and intentions that could describe or help us understand individual actions, a skepticism of the rule of law, and the importance of patronage networks. Again, Cadiot significantly deepens our knowledge of socialism as a political economy and a lived experience and how it worked. She explores the role of lawyers, of the procuracy, of judges, of the police, and of the party, And she describes for us, this was another thing I thought was particularly effective. She does not merely make clear that there was significant infighting among these various parties, but she actually helps us understand the logics of this infighting, particularly, I think, that which went on between the party and the Procuracy, as an outgrowth of different and sometimes conflicting objectives within the ecosystem of socialist governance. We see a debate as it unfolded. Let me admit some to the waiting room there. Within the Soviet system, arguments that are put forward that punishments for theft must be harsher than in the capitalist world, because the excuses in the socialist system were fewer. Everyone can have a job if they're willing to work. We see this impulse pushing up against a desire equally at home in the logic of building socialism to understand the intentions and the personal stories behind an instance of theft, to contextualize thieves. We also see one of the interesting features of the parsing of property into socialist categories, personal, state, and non-state. For instance, and this was another one of those rich examples that she gives, how to treat the theft of a purse. The theft of a purse, it turned out, was not or did not need to be a unitary event. It had one meaning if the money inside of the purse belonged solely to the purse's owner, and quite another if that money was taken from the cash register of her workplace on its way to the bank. Cadiot shows us that even in the 1930s, as laws grew more stringent, there was at times an unwillingness to apply them in full force and a toleration for borrowing, shall we say, from the state on the part of state authorities. This was a stunning example, the idea that upon discovering what would ordinarily be classified as an instance of embezzlement, the people who discovered this act said, well, you know, let's wait a bit. He'll bring the rest of the money that he embezzled back soon. So this unwillingness to apply the full force of the law, termed socialist humanism, did not exactly lead to humane socialism. One of the things that Cadiot also achieves is a startling look at the content, the role played by thieving in the Gulag or thieves in the Gulag. We see that 190,000 minors were incarcerated within the Gulag system between 1946 and 1953. More than 2 million minors passed through in those same years, many for a few days, she says, and many with their mothers who were themselves jailed. One of the things that Cadiot explores very effectively, I think, are the ways in which many different groups within this legal or ecosystem, the governing apparatus, attempted to soften the application of the law. And as she argues, these efforts to soften sentences should not be understood as a form of opposition either, any more than the thieving itself should, but rather as a critical dimension of the Soviet legal system that worked in concert, particularly with patronage. Patronage is something that Cadiot takes very seriously, not as a deviation from the proper operation of socialism or an archaic holdover from, ancient Russian society, but rather as a modern feature of single-party rule, in keeping with the emphasis on fidelity to the communist project and the Communist Party as a means of filtering or grasping that fidelity, something that could be known by individuals whose testimony was therefore important and valuable. This argument is in keeping with the broad theme of the book. In the words of Michel Foucault, Cadiot attempts to understand the organization of illegalities. Overall, the story is of changes in the social representation of theft rather than changes in the practices themselves, leaving aside a few key moments, such as the currency reform of 1947, which offered, as Cadiot shows, remarkably capacious opportunities for abuse. One of the chief lessons for me in this book had to do with developing my appreciation for the extensive, indeed remarkable, financial savvy that was wielded by the street level bureaucrats that Cadiot explores and examines. These people have big time economic skill in manipulating the features of the socialist account books. In places, we see the party state valued this knowledge explicitly, as in the hiring for certain posts. Say, I enjoyed this tidbit, railway buffet manager was known to be a job that former thieves would be good for. They could use their networks profitably in that position. These stories, these moments that Cadiot describes might seem to be a perversion of the socialist project, but, and this is my final point, and perhaps a bit contrary to what Juliette, you were saying in your comments, so I'm curious to explore some of this tension. What I understood you, in fact, to be showing was the persistence of an anti-property sentiment. You're speaking in your comments about the lengths to which the state was willing to go to defend its property. And obviously, that is one of the powerful imports of the book. I was equally struck, however, by the persistence of this unwillingness to fully commit to the defense of property for the defense of property's sake. As witnessed, for instance, in your discussion of the somewhat stunted development of contract law and this toleration of borrowing from the state. So I would pose first that question to you, perhaps we can bring up for discussion. And my second question, apropos of your introductory comments as well, one of the things that is most remarkable about this book that I enjoyed, especially about it, was its articulation of a geography of thieving. We hear about two places in particular, however, aside from Moscow and the capitals. We hear about Uzbekistan and we hear about Ukraine. And particularly Ukraine, as you undoubtedly know, occupies an important place in the imaginary of thieving, at least in the revolutionary era, but from some of the later works on corruption, memoirs of corruption from the late Soviet period as well, Ukraine stands out as a space where some of these big networks rooted themselves. So I was hoping you would be able to comment for us a bit on the geography of thieving inside the post-war Soviet Union. I will turn it back to you, although I also leave it to you or to Yanni whether we should allow Juliette an opportunity to speak again or open the floor up to questions from the group.
So Juliette, it's up to you. I mean, you can go into direct dialogue with Anne, or we can open it up and you can accumulate some questions, whatever you like.
Now I can just maybe answer the very last question, and thank you very much, Anne, for your wonderful comments. It's always a pleasure to hear such nice tea. I don't know how to say that. About this geography of thieves, if we can draw a kind of differences between national republics or regions, it will be, of course, interesting to go a little bit further, because I think this book could be, but obviously it will be more and more difficult to achieve, but could be at the beginning of work on this direction. That means that I saw it a lot of details. We don't even know so much about the problem of contract, as you said, the problem of litigation, the problem of arbitrage. We don't know about how the lawyer in the enterprise, the accounting. Even I have some data about to what extent the national system of accounting after the war was extremely strange. That means that you have some exchange of data at the level of the Council of Ministry, where they are counting in billion or in million. And you really feel that there is all this wealth and a very difficulty to grasp the amount. and how to organize this socialist property, this treasury. About the geography, I have one student. We will, for example, work on smuggling in Georgia, and he tried to find some patterns. That means that some continuity and some economic tradition, where the smuggling was already there at the end of the empire and will continue to the end of the 30s and even the 40s. I think it will be very useful, of course, to do so also for Central Asia, of course, the Caucasus, because there were always this reputation during Soviet times that some republics were more corrupt, and Vladimir Putin used it again against Ukraine in his talk in February 22 to say that Ukraine was never able to deal with this problem of corruption. But I don't know if it's always very difficult to know if there is some characteristic. Maybe in the very specific field of doing exchange you can find, but otherwise, I think this kind of reputation, it was also the reputation, as we know, some data from the number of people who were shot for economic crimes during the Khrushchev and Brezhnev era. And many of them were Jews, as there is this reputation for Jews. And of course, we have to take it very critically, because of course, you have some stereotypes who were also very embedded, even in the prosecution itself. I mean, that is why the geography is, I was, on the contrary, very surprised to what extent the problem of patronage was widespread and was a way of functioning for the Soviet Union. And it was not a legacy so much of, or maybe it was a legacy of the empire, but it was not so cultural, it was also very functional and very linked to this terrible face of modernity the Soviet Union brings, and especially Stalin brings. That means the destruction of network makes the network more makes the protection and networks more lively, which is counterintuitive. But when they destroy so much the society, you see that they are there. And when the state is so strange to understand that the small networks are going on all the time, and they are trying to bribe all the time. And when you are a chief, you have to bribe the party, to bribe the prosecution, and you understand that it is the rules. And it's very well described by the historian of the 18th century, for example, late modern is, what do you say, late modern story? And we in France we say histoire moderne, modern histories. It means that, and when the more centralized state arrive, patronage will be more active, and it's really much so, even during the Stalin era, which is also, once again, not now there is more study on that, but normally is also counterintuitive. That means it goes against the idea that the individual was alone facing the state. And that's true that the thieves networks, they were the ones who were caught or who were in the archive, because sometimes they were not punished finally, make it very clear that there was this form of underground live network society. And maybe your second question was about the problem of enforcement, I guess. I mean, that the problem of to what extent, no, it's not just a problem. That means that it seems that really this law, and is what Beria said actually, but he said a lot of things, many things. But this law, again, thieves, was considered as exaggerated. Even if they understood and they will say in the discourses, many small thieves means the lack of wealth for our state, and we have to construct a new state, we have to accumulate grains, we have to accumulate in order to develop our country. There is various archives who show that they wanted to open the gate of the Gulag because there were many thieves, and the cruelty of this law seems to be counterproductive. And we see, I saw some documents for the period after Stalin as well, but they were also cut by the publisher. But for sure that the problem of theft continue to an extent incredible. That means that they continue to steal as we all know, everywhere. And there were more, in this case, the idea that they can take it. They can take it. That means that the system was able to recognize that the people could get some of these things and stuff, and to share by this illegal way part of the socialist wealth. There is a kind of new social contract, or economic contract they can take. And they have a problem in enforcement, because when they try to say, no, we have to be very more serious about that, they were not really able to, because it was too many crimes, and they didn't really want to deal with that. And you have a lot of conversation in the 70s on that, about how to enforce a new law on theft and protection of socialist property.
No, and I just will add, I see Jane has her hand up, but I just wanted to add that one of the things I think is extremely valuable is your emphasis on the costs to the state that were involved in protecting state property. So they were enormous, the guards in the buildings, and they will be recognizable to anybody who has spent time in post-Soviet society, in the preponderance of people guarding things. Jane.
Yeah. The problem is that the cost of theft was they were not able really to give some data, and I have a part on that. That means that they tried to build a data to show how much money was embezzled, and but they use the tribunal data. We are not enough. And the other problem we need to know, because when you see the data, on the contrary, there were no theft so much. I mean, but it's a problem everywhere. I mean, that is a problem of, and Yanni knows more about that.
Well, and this is one other point that I think you made very successfully, was and this is a question, to what extent was this feature of economic activity an outgrowth of other features of the socialist economy? And I think you mentioned this in particular when it comes to the problem of inflation, and the inflation that is built in, and that was built in at that moment, that a lot of this activity was designed to accommodate, essentially, to work around. And so I'm so intrigued by the idea of trying to calculate the cost of theft, because one of the things that your book makes so clear is that it was next to impossible to disentangle the stolen from the, and connected to the qualities of money in the period. But enough. I don't want to keep Jane waiting any longer.
Okay.
Jane, did you? I think there we go.
Oh, well, thanks for this wonderful book and wonderful discussion. I have a question about the impact on social attitudes about property and value more generally. I really take to heart the comments Anne made about how the ambiguities about individual, private, public, state property are become part of daily life. And I remember very well in what was then Leningrad, a friend of mine telling me about her mother, who was a survivor of the siege of Leningrad. And she said her mother was always telling her that one of the things that hurt her most in her memory was that one day while working in a state enterprise, she took money from the cash register and she used it to buy milk for her younger brother who was starving. And she just held this memory all her life as something extraordinarily painful that she had done to save her own brother. But my question is about the role of hierarchies of whether people in Soviet society, as you saw it, had a sense of legitimate hierarchies of accumulation of property. Sometimes we hear people say in late Soviet society, oh, it's good that our rulers live so well. You know, they should live well. Or if you want to take someone who took a different approach, Navalny's video showing that Putin built this extraordinary palace for himself is supposed to engender hostility in society toward Putin. But I'm wondering whether in the system of patronage, essential patronage that you described, did people have a sense that the bosses who may be stealing a lot of state property or manipulating a lot of state property should have more property than they? Is there a sense anywhere of a dedication to equally shared property, or even in this system of appropriated, let's say, state property? Did people have a sense that hierarchy was natural, that some people should have more property than others? That's my question.
Thank you, Jane. The answer is about hierarchy of wealth. I don't think that they have a sense of it because, first of all, at the period I am deal with, and your memory you were talking about remind me of a lot of talk about the fact that they were just surviving. That means that after the war, there are no wealth. And the small things they try to accumulate, because when you don't have anything, you try more to accumulate. That means that the small little product are potatoes sometimes is a way to have more power and to exchange and to put it in an exchange kind of way, which was not the planification exchange. It was an interpersonal exchange to make possible to survive and to get some it's even the blood issue, but it's not a blood kind of form. That means that for me, it's not about a hierarchy of wealth by itself, but it is really about a hierarchy of power. That means that when you have things to deal with, when you are in this circulation of things very quickly, when you know that you have a thing, you can exchange it and to give it, and by this way you can have something else, you are in. And this, I don't know, it's a social capital, but it's not the social capital by itself. It's really this ability to deal with relation, protection, and things. Because you have this protection and the small one, sometimes in the case I studied in chapter 4 or something, it's a small amount, it's not even money sometimes. It's just some potatoes, some fruit, and some vegetable, but connected with high power, with high protection. Because of course, the biggest protection, it is to escape the Gulag camps. It means that it's to escape the incredible penal system where your daily life could be all the time in danger, because there is this law on theft, and there is also a law against social bad social behavior and so on. the theft law was a principle after the Second World War, and you have to protect yourself against sometimes a lot of penal menace, but also other people. I think it is why I don't see accumulation of wealth and stable things during this period. It's not the same after. And what is very interesting is to see that during Khrushchev, at the very beginning of Khrushchev, they start to be very shocked, especially in the police and some secret police report I saw, by really the wealth. I mean, in terms of big house, big cars, the very beginning of a society where you can get stuff. And they were extremely shocked by the fact that party bosses everywhere were able to get cars and big outing. But it's not the same matrix. I mean that for me, there is something which was different. But the idea actually that that it's good to get to be wealthy doesn't exist, but it's good to be protected and to be powerful exists. And that is good because he has a connection and he could protect his own and so on. This accumulation from of power is viewed as something important, and the protection they offer. And it's very clear for the Stalin period. And it's also very well studied by the last book by Kleveniuk and Gorlitsky. That means that you have really this patronage network, and protection patronage are extremely powerful at the regional and Republican level. I don't know if I spent well.
Juliette,
yes.
Juliette, could I ask you something?
Yeah, of course.
So I have one question, which is more like it's a little more abstract, but underlies, I think, the entire project, and it underlies anything that anybody does in the Soviet period. And it's a difficult one, and God knows we're not going to answer it, but we can at least discuss it. Which is that because of the very nature of the Soviet system, which is to say that property, or most property, belongs to the state, and we are the state. It leaves open from the very beginning of the Soviet project this ambiguity about who is doing what to whom. I mean, who is the subject and who is the object, if you know what I mean. So if I were to steal, I am theoretically stealing from myself, right? But no, because this is, I think, the moment that you're looking at, which is the practical problem of Soviet power, which is that some institution within the Soviet state takes on responsibility of enforcing rules, right? But it itself is not an owner any more than you or I are owners. So it's possible to say, and I'm pretty sure it was said, and I think there's elements of it in your writings, that when I steal from the Soviet state, it's fine because I am the Soviet state, right? You know what I'm saying? And it even introduces this problem that I've grappled with, and I'm sure others much better than myself, like yourself, which is that the very grammar that we use to describe this. Do we use we or do we use I? Do we use "the" or "v", right? And sort of, you know what I'm saying? Now, some of this was grappled with in the early Soviet theories, economic theories. Preobrazhensky did some, Bukharin did some, and their answer was completely confused. It was, everyone and nobody was their answer to all these questions. By the time we get to your period, we're introducing Stalinism, and Stalinism is really a much more structured understanding of socialism, with very clear sets of corporate identities, and also a clear sense of executive versus legislative versus and so on and so forth. Can you add to that conversation? I mean, you have already, I think. Is there a way that you've grappled with this and encountered it? Because the Soviet phenomenon is actually different, right? It's
yeah. Thank you very much for this question. And it's true that the people who are more kind of specialists of civil law say that normally, since socialist poverty is the poverty of everybody in the society, and actually the penal side of the law changes. That means that the 32 and the 47 laws changes. That means that by penalize theft, that you change this feeling. That means that for the jurists it's obvious. Not the jurists of this time, because at this time they couldn't say that. But for the jurists, we look at this law on poverty. Now they are saying that by civil law you don't see the differences between state and public. But after it's more complex also, I think, after the war, because there are more theoretization after the war on this problem of socialist poverty after the Second World War.
I'm sorry, did you say theorization?
Yeah, theoretization. Yep. And you have the first book really on state poverty and socialist poverty. And also, I think there is an effort, I guess, in other countries, but I'm sure that they don't speak to each other. But you have also public enterprise and public property in the capitalist world, and you have also a way to distinguish what is public and what is at everybody, at everyone. And this effort for the Soviet case is changed because I really think so. It changed because of this penalization of theft. That means that the criminalization of theft was so highly not enforced, but introduced in the practice of the Procuracy and in the writing of even the civil law, that you don't have the question of how to share this commonwealth was not asked. And one of the arguments, which is metaphoric, of course, of my book, is to say that all this accumulation of wealth finally were in the hand of Stalin, who was the only one to decide where to invest and what kind of economy we want. But and you don't have so many way to distribute this wealth, even if some minister or sometimes try to lobby to get access to. That's the first maybe part of the question. The second part is about how the people were thinking, how they grasp this idea of socialist state property. And for sure, in the later I saw from Thieves, they have this popular idea, or they have this idea that the social state should be toward poor people and should be equalitarian. And even there are this paternalistic vision that because they are poor and from factories, or they had a very difficult life, they should be protected by the state. And if the state tells them, send them to the Gulag because they took something, they are shocked. Some of them could say that they are very shocked. And because there are also, I can use this term of social contract, they have this feeling in this letter that the regime is normally a regime which was built for people like them, the poor people, the unfrightened people. And the moment when they were sent in the Gulag is a moment, of course, of shock, but also a moment for them it's also they will try to, when they send the letter to the state to ask for clemency, they will try to make palpable this protective power of the state. The ideology of a protective state for the poor are very lively.
And so there's a follow-on to this, Juliette.
Yeah.
Which is that this, I mean, this is not exactly what you're writing about, but you have spoken about it and it does come in, which is not so much theft per se, but corruption and networks of corruption. You know, and again, it relates to the problem of the state, which is to say that, you know, any state, but especially the Soviet one, is so big as to be meaningless in and of itself, right? Meaning it's, until it introduces structures, hierarchies, borders, and so on and so forth, eternal borders, that is too big to be meaningful as a guide to what we do in our daily lives. You know, who belongs where, who can do what, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been an argument made, not so much in relation to the Soviet case, but in relation to Western modern states.
Mm-hmm.
Any other term is modern, right? That corruption serves to personalize the state. Which is to say that it makes it practical, it makes it intimate, so that when you turn to your network in order to secure goods or privileges or whatever, that what you're doing is actually actualizing the state and putting the state into practice in a way that's actually much more personal than the state could ever be. And that in this sense, it's almost like a comforting humanistic element to the state, insofar as you can have corrupt personal relations with all sorts of other people. I think this is also implicit in a lot of what you write. And I wonder if you have thoughts about that.
Yeah, about this this idea of personalization, and that means that the modern state is so abstract that the networks and corruption is a way to make it more personal and more normal with a human face. Is I think very critical, and I just quote very quickly Gambetta and others who wrote about it, it's very true. It's also very true that during this period, it's a human but frightening face. That means that the relationship. The corrupt relationship are very brutalized, and very brutal. Of course, I work with thieves, but you really see not some, even in the kind of, sometime in the party patronage, there is also a way to help their own people, and there is a protective side. But it is, it's the social relation are personalized, very personalized, but very brutal. And once again, you see, you even see some very small Stalin everywhere. That means that's a kind of someone who has so much wealth of power, but everybody is frightened by him, and he could be very vocal about his corruption. That means that he won't hide it. One of the things I found very curious, because there is this penal situation where when you are a thief, you can be sent to the Gulag camp for a long time, but they will nonetheless show sometimes their wealth. There will be very they don't try really to hide their power when they are corrupt, and they feel protected. But yeah,
I mean, brutality is also a form of intimacy. Do you want to give some examples of what you mean by brutality in this case?
Brutality means, for example, that, but for the case I studied in Kyiv, that the boss of the enterprise will will ask all his collaborators to come in his office with money, and he will collect money quite brutally, and he will be described as a very brutal guy, and it's the same for a lot of discussion, especially in the archives of the party, because for the corruption, the archives of the party were very critical when they describe in the session of the party how they talk to each other also is very brutalized and brutal. Not
You mean crude? Crude, you mean? Crude?
Yeah, cruel, or even there is a few words, but some orders and threats, and you see they don't see each other so much. It's that's the feeling I get. That means that because for the late modern historian, the face of this of the state could be also very protective. It could be the church, it could be an aristocrat. We will organize some salon, whatever. In this case, it's the atmosphere is very more silent and brutal.
Could I just jump in right on this? I see we have a hand raised, so I don't want to interrupt that process, but just right on this. I'm struck by the extent to which, though, in this way, I understood one of the key interventions of your book to be really a statement about the difficulties of identifying corruption from other practices engaged in economic production. And so I'm curious about, when you're talking about this, it seems instead that there is something distinctive or separate from the everyday practices of economic negotiation that all kolkhoz directors engage in, for instance. And I'm curious whether, are you talking about a difference in scale? In this, I mean, one of the things you've introduced is the idea that certainly state authorities sought to establish differences in scale, that certain problems or certain acts of theft, warranted severe treatment because of how grandiose they were. How would you characterize this landscape of appropriation? I know that's a very big question.
Really, during this period of Stalin, there is no so much accumulation of wealth, first of all. That means that even the big one, we were shot. There is few of them. And it's more because of their networks and the amount of money or amount of embezzlement. Once again, for me, especially at this moment, it's more this capacity to act because you could exchange with a lot of people and you have some amount of wealth or amount of things you can exchange, but it's more this social capacity, which is threatening for the state, and which is also a good asset if the state accepts and agreed that you continue this way. And because of course most of them could continue this way. So where the one we were finally shot, there were few of them, and I don't have all data because normally you shouldn't be shot at this time for economic crimes. You have to change the qualification, and it was the secret police who did it. That means that we don't have statistics for at this period. It won't be the case for the Khrushchev era, but for the Stalin era, normally we even thought that there were no economic crimes shooting. That means that normally it was not, because the penal, the capital penalty was, as you know, short and limited. various crime, and especially to treason. And I don't know if I answer really what our question, but for this time, you don't have such accumulation of very corrupt networks, and you have an ongoing perpetual corruption. And and the second part of the question, and it's true that I don't answer that, it's about the qualification, and that's true. And when you see the functioning of the economy, which is so complex, because when you have state economy, socialist economy, planification, and control is extremely difficult. And you really see in this in the material I gather to what extent the managers didn't have any skills. Some of them, they receive very very lately qualifications. They don't have jurists they try to implement it. You really feel that at the very beginning of this construction of the socialist economy, there is a discrepancy and a tremendous difficulty to deal with the complexity of this model of the socialist economy. And
that's exactly
and once again, it's just this the punishment. As a very terrible punishment, was a kind of demonstration of strength and the cruelty, and it was a wish that by this example the people will well behave. But it's not a very sophisticated way of governing such an incredible economic machine. And that for sure the procurators, they don't know. Sometimes it's a procuracy, we will even try to write some laws. You feel a big difficulty, conceptual and skill difficulty to deal with this new model. And this is why it's also so tragic, because you don't there sometimes even, but there is one example which is very severe, because it was so complicated to try to just stop frauds, that they said that when you are for quality of meat is too much, because you can change, of course, the quantity of good meat for the second meat. You can do all these frauds. And they said, no, the only way to make it easy is just to have one category of meat, and it won't be any problem anymore of dealing with this problem. And
well, it's the classic point, right? Excuse me.
No, but
that there were never enough norms, that the normed economy failed because you could never generate enough norms.
No, but the same in the capitalist world, actually. But well, yeah, and you have also, and I was also very surprised to what extent the jurists were involved, actually. And sometimes it's just they want to punish someone, and in this occasion they will discover a lot of frauds, and they will describe this fraud, but since there were no norms before, they don't know if they have to punish or not. And you have all this discussion with the jurists and the judges, is why also it was so relaxed for a lot of people. That means they don't have the law is always
following behind. There's a lot more to pursue there with the capitalist economy, but this question, Yanni, would you like to call on our questioner, or shall I?
Yeah, I'm the host, so yeah, I'll do that. So Ana Hiritoyu.
Yes, hi. Hello. So
hello.
Thank you for a fascinating discussion, and thanks to Anne as well for a very comprehensive summary for those of us who didn't get their hands on the book yet. My question is a bit of an aside from this discussion. I'm an anthropologist working with Roma on the topic of stealing, and I only had a cursory look at archives, but archives in the 50s and 60s in Romania is my research, mention theft by Roma in particular as a kind of endemic problem. But interestingly, it's not like this kind of understanding extended to disenfranchised communities, but more of a cultural problem, like it's an innate quality. So I was wondering whether you came across this topic, because you did mention the Jewish minority before, but I was wondering if Roma also featured in this. So thank you.
Thank you for your question and your comment. Actually, no, I haven't seen so much Roma because I guess they were accused by the police more of stealing personal property. That means that there is this idea that since they were more disenfranchised and they don't have all the time a job or a permanent job, they will change of jobs, they will try to travel a little bit more around the country, and they were accused more of this stealing personal property. And you have this distinguish, that means that the criminal world, the vori and so on, and the criminal underground were viewed as more thieves of personal property, which of course is not very clear because as Anne said, the distinction between socialist and personal property is not so easy to make, but nonetheless, they are more seen, as this kind of, during Khrushchev especially, as this kind of, underworld, criminal, underground and underworld, and is what I saw. For the Jewish, it was different. That means that it was the idea that they were in the system. It was also a very kind of cultural and idea, but that they were in the system, but they will play their own rules. And it was also very linked to the anti-Semitism of this time. That means that it was obvious in some prosecution that they were the idea. They also have idea for the Jewish side that they have their own tribunals, their own way to dealing with problems, that they have important networks, wealthy networks, where they will use rabbinic tribunals. We are totally illegal, and also I don't know if there is the same with the Roma, this idea of counterculture, which is built also in a way to organize themselves, and also to have their own kind of tribunals, and which means that they are outside the state surveillance and outside the state power.
Right, so legible before all else, right? One would need to be legible before all else.
Yeah, they were not legible anymore.
Mm-hmm. Are there any other comments? We're actually at the end of our allotted time, our usual allotted time, but there is flexibility. Anne, is there something you wanted to add?
And said a lot.
I fear I've already said more than enough, but I look forward, Juliette, to continuing this conversation. I think we have another project about poverty in the works.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Juliette, thank you again, especially for taking the time in the middle of what I know is a very busy and crisis-ridden time for you.
It was very nice to see all of you, and I will be back to my current work of trying to be in touch with colleagues, we will try to be in touch, all of us, also, because it's very difficult time, and it will be important to build networks and continue to do some science, even if
No, and you have our admiration for your scholarship, obviously, but also for the work you're doing at this very moment.
yeah, but it's not so much. There is some of us are even more engaged actually, but yeah, we are all in the CSEC is quite no, but it's worse in Warsaw and other context. Okay, but thank you very much for your invitation.
Thanks again.
And
Thank you so much, Juliette. Bye.
bye-bye.